Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch. I am your host Vikas Swarup. On the 1st of December 2022, India assumed the presidency of the G20 or Group of 20 Nations and will host the G20 summit in New Delhi on September 9 and 10 this year. The G20 is the world's most influential economic multilateral forum. It is the global agenda-setting body that guides international financial institutions and develops and enforces rules of global economic governance. Given that this is a watershed moment in our history, we have been bringing you a series of dispatches on various aspects of India's G20 presidency. Today, we are privileged to have a very special guest with us who is responsible for the organization and management of the biggest diplomatic event in India's history, the Chief Coordinator for the G20, Ambassador Harsh Vardhan Shringla. Ambassador Shringla is one of India's most outstanding diplomats, having served as Foreign Secretary, Ambassador to USA, High Commissioner to Bangladesh, and Ambassador to Thailand. He took over as the Chief Coordinator for G20 on May 1, 2022. Welcome to the show, Ambassador Shringla.
Thank you, Vikas.
Let me start with the most basic question. What exactly does being President of the G20 entail, and why is it so important?
Well, first of all, let me say it's great to be on your show. To answer your question, we have to examine the context in which India has taken over presidency of the G20, both from a domestic standpoint and from an international point of view. Now, internationally, obviously, you see that there's a great deal of flux and uncertainty. The world has just recovered from perhaps the greatest shock to the international system in the COVID-19 pandemic. And almost no sooner than this had happened, we had the Ukraine conflict. Now, what we've seen is that not just parties to the conflict, but countries that are far away from the epicenter of both the COVID pandemic and the Ukraine conflict have faced the adverse consequences of these situations, whether it's in terms of the cost of fuel and food, whether it's in terms of the lowering growth rates and increasing inflation, or in the increasing indebtedness that states are experiencing. In fact, the developing world is facing the brunt of this. And I'm told about 90 developing countries are on the verge, are either indebted or on the verge of indebtedness. So obviously, it's a concern at a global level. On the other hand, from our perspective, if you look at the context, we are in our 75th year of our independence. We are entering into the stage of Amrit Kaal. The next 25 years will be critical to India's development. We want to see ourselves as a Viksit Bharat by 2047. And at the same time, I think we have, in many senses, shown that we have been a resilient economy in the face of the COVID crisis. At about 7% growth, which is projected this year, we will be the fastest growing large economy in the world. So, whether it's our developmental achievements through digital transformations, we have used digital platforms to take development to the grassroots level to ensure that the most vulnerable sections of our population have been benefited. Or whether it's our enormous, I would say, the strides that we've taken in areas like green and clean energy, whether it is renewable energy, solar power, or it is green hydrogen. I think India has shown the way forward. How can we use our experiences and achievements to bring them to scale that can benefit the developing world? And in today's context, where there is a great deal of polarization and fragmentation that we see across the world, what is needed in terms of a G20 presidency is to bridge the gaps, bring countries together on issues that are important to countries all over the world. And here I think is where our role is important and where the expectation from India as a country that represents in many senses the interests of the developing world, but at the same time is at the high table with the most powerful nations of the world. How can we provide solutions to the challenges that the globe faces today?
Correct. So, as you have rightly said, India is perceived to be the voice of the Global South. So, what are the kinds of issues pertaining to the Global South that India will be articulating at the G20? More broadly, what will be our priorities?
So, I mean, if you look at the priorities, the broad priorities that we have set, we have looked at what is really, what are the compelling factors today? What do countries want, both from the developed and the developing world? And we've arrived at 4 or 5 main areas. One of them is growth, of course. Everybody wants to see a certain amount of momentum towards growth at a time when you have falling GDPs and increasing inflation. So accelerated, sustainable, inclusive growth is one of the priorities of our presidency. We've also seen that the Sustainable Development Goals, of which we were party to when the UN adopted it, is in the middle of its let's say progress and its course is actually faltering. Because of COVID and other reasons, we've seen Sustainable Development Goals actually being affected. So what can the G20 do to ensure that this growth momentum is carried forward? The third, of course, is, as I mentioned, areas like digital transformations, where we have a tremendous amount of experience. How can we use our experience in financial inclusion, ensuring that benefits go to hundreds of millions of billions of people across the world? Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji pointed out at the Bali summit, G20 summit in Bali, which was held recently, he said 40% of total global transactions have been through UPI. In other words, India is contributing to 40% of digital transactions across the world. So digital payments in India have come to be a part of our lives, but it's been facilitated by innovations, technology, and providing digital platforms that serve the interests of the larger population. At the same time, of course, we are looking to see how we can, as I said, bring this to scale and also make it available to the developing world. We've already done this. If you remember the CoWIN platform that we used to vaccinate 220 crore people in our country, the CoWIN platform was made open source. We had a CoWIN global conclave in which 142 countries participated, and there was a great amount of interest in taking the CoWIN technology in ensuring smooth vaccination programs across the developing world. So we actually have an opportunity to work with our partners in G20 to bring this to countries across the world. The next priority from our perspective, of course, is a green development compact of sorts. How can we push forward the agenda of climate financing, for example, climate justice? If you recall, Prime Minister Modi at COP26 in Glasgow made very, very far-reaching commitments in terms of our climate actions. Countries all over the world have done that. But it's important that the necessary climate financing is available, technology is available. You need to bring those commitments to actual fruition or reality. And here I think is where we could try and work with our partners in providing for that. At the same time, we have also said it's not climate actions alone. You have to also lead lifestyles that are sustainable. The Prime Minister has articulated the concept of lifestyle for environment, leading sustainable lifestyles. UN Secretary General, who was here, pointed out that the world is living at an unsustainable level. We are living at 1.6 times what the world can sustain. So obviously we have to do something to scale back that level of consumption. In fact, the SDGs themselves called for sustainable consumption, sustainable production. So here is where I think we can make the difference through the Lifestyle for Environment program or the Pro-Planet People. And I think this is something that we hope to do through our presidency. Again, I think the issue of reforming multilateral institutions has been raised by Prime Minister Modi in last 8 or 9 summits. From our perspective, this is an important agenda because after all, the institutions that were created in the wake of the Second World War today have seen the limits of their utility. I mean, in order to make them relevant to today's context, you have to obviously reform them. You have to bring them into line with the realities of today's contemporary world. And from that perspective, what we are saying is that we would like to work with these institutions, especially the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF and the World Bank, to see how we can strengthen their mandate to provide for the requirements of today's day and age. As I said, I mean, there are a whole range of developing countries that are at the levels of indebtedness. How can the IMF and World Bank help them? Can they extend their mandates to include private sector financing, blended financing, public-private partnerships? How can we provide for climate financing? How can we provide for financing of developing countries? So these are areas that we intend to work on. And the final, of course, priority for us is women-led development. I mean, women have great priority in terms of their entry into the workforce in India. Their involvement in society at every level is already there. But how can we do more to ensure a women-led development, women-led growth, both in our country and the rest of the world? So we will be taking that up in the G20.
We now have a logo and a theme for our presidency, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, One Earth, One Family, One Future. Can you explain to our viewers the thinking behind the choice of this particular theme?
Well, the theme itself is not just a theme that we've adopted for the G20. As you know, it has always been a part of our tradition, our ethos, our philosophy, that the world is one family, that we are close. I mean, the world may be consisting of diverse nations, but at the end of the day, we are one. And in today's context, as I said, where there is such a lot of fragmentation, polarization, this concept is all the more relevant. And which is why we came up with that theme for our presidency. Although it has always been within our country, but this theme is relevant today in the international context. And of course, we look at it as you mentioned, it is not just one Earth, it's one family, but also one future. That our future is also together. And this is not just the future of humankind. We're talking also about the animal and plants of the of the earth, and they're also part of this sort of holistic approach to dealing with the issue, which is essentially important when you have concepts that we have also come out with. One health, for example, or one earth. That concept takes into account the fact that we need a holistic approach when we move forward. And Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam also means that we work with everybody concerned. I give you an example that in 2020, when COVID had started really becoming a global issue, it was Prime Minister Modi who called for a special summit of the G20, and the Saudi Arabian presidency at that time actually held this summit on COVID-19. And the summit did some very good work. But at that summit, the Prime Minister said that he called for human-centric globalization. Mm-hmm. And he said that this is the first time that the G20 had met on an issue that is not financial and economic in nature, but encompasses humanitarian concerns of the globe. And if you recall, at that time, the G20 adopted the Debt Service Suspension Initiative that allowed developing countries a moratorium on repayment of interest and principals on their loans. And we were a party to that. And I think this is where we can make that critical difference. India has always worked under Prime Minister Modi's vision for the global common good, and we have used our Atmanirbhar Bharat, the strengths from our self-reliance, to help other countries, whether it's been vaccinations, it's been therapeutics, it's been assistance during COVID, any other way or lines of credit. We have helped the developing world in its time of need.
Now, every G20 president gets to invite a select group of countries as guests. Who all are we inviting and why?
Well, we have invited our immediate neighbors. So Bangladesh, which is our closest neighbor, is a part of that list of invitees. We've also invited Mauritius. From the Gulf region, that's our extended neighborhood. We've invited Oman and UAE. From Africa, we've invited Nigeria and Egypt. What is important to note is that in doing so, we have the largest representation of African nations that I think any G20 presidency has had before. With 6 African countries represented in our summit, I think the focus on Africa, the focus on the developing world will be very strong. And certainly, and of course, I must also add that we've invited some international institutions. One is the ADB, the Asian Development Bank. The other is the International Solar Alliance, and also the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. So these 3 international organizations have also been invited. So we have invited a total of 9 invitees, countries and international organizations to our summit.
Now, the US took its G20 presidency to 12 cities, China to 14 cities, and Indonesia to 25. We are taking it to 56 cities across the length and breadth of the country, from Kashmir to Kerala. What is the motivation behind taking the G20 to so many cities?
Well, it's a new record in the G20. I don't think any country in the past, as you correctly pointed out, has done this. I doubt any country can achieve this because very few countries have the geographical spread, but at the same time, the level of federalism that we have. So when we talk about cooperative federalism, we really mean that we involve the rest of our country. Actually, this is Prime Minister Modi's vision. From his point of view, the G20 presidency is not one that should be confined to the central government. It should belong to the states, it should belong to every individual citizen of India. So the idea is not only through having the G20 meetings at 56 locations across our country, covering every state and union territory, is to make sure that that every state and every individual is a stakeholder in that process. And what is being done is that through Jan Bhagidari and Jan Andolan, we are trying to get the message of our G20 presidency down to the grassroots level. So every individual in India, every student in school or university should understand what our presidency is all about, what this means for India, and what we are trying to do at a global level. And I think that exercise has been one that we might have already noticed. We've had the University Connect program. We are connecting with youth. We are connecting through festivals like the International Kite Festival or the Sand Festival. And we are connecting also, through marathons, quiz competitions across the country. And when you host these meetings in all of these different states and union territories, you will actually expose these places to international events. Many of these places have never been exposed to international events. For the first time, they'll be hosting such a major event. And at the same time, you will be building capacity where there hasn't been capacity, whether it's in conference centers, whether it's upgradation of roads, beautification of cities. We are telling states that this is your opportunity. Transform your cities, make that essential difference. And we have seen it in cities like Udaipur, Mumbai, Bangalore, Kolkata. These are the first few meetings, venues, and we've seen that sort of transformation in these cities. We'd like to see it across the country. And so the philosophy behind taking G20, and making it something that belongs to the entire country is something unique. You would recall that both in the NAM and CHOGM summits were in Delhi, and those were one-off events. Here you have 215 meetings, and you have the opportunity to broad base it at a scale that has never been done before. It's very unique, but it's also challenging, I must add, as an organizer, to create capacities, to take it to places where there has been limited exposure to international events is challenging. But I think we will not only succeed, but we will make an excellent job out of it.
I'm pretty sure about that. Now, Prime Minister Modi has said that India's presidency will be inclusive, ambitious, action-oriented and decisive. At the same time, as you have yourself pointed out, the world is facing multiple challenges. It is also a deeply divided and polarized world. The Russia-Ukraine conflict in particular has reshaped global politics. So how can India be a uniter and a consensus builder in such a difficult environment?
So our worldview on this has been known. I mean, Prime Minister Modi has gone on record to say that this is not an era of war. In fact, his statement found itself into the Bali Declaration of the G20 in December. We've also, I think, always engaged with the parties concerned. Even recently, the Prime Minister had a phone call both with President Putin and with President Zelensky. As far as we are concerned, we would like to focus in areas that unite the world, focus in areas that bring peace and development. We've always made it clear that diplomacy and dialogue are the only ways out, and we will be consistent in applying that under our presidency. I think the larger message that we want to convey is that there is a great deal of responsibility when it comes to the G20. The expectations, not just the G20 members, but the larger global community of the G20 and our presidency are very significant. In order to meet those expectations, we have to focus on the issues that are important to the world, not allow ourselves to be, let's say, divided by issues that are there on the table, but the G20 perhaps is not the place for that. In other words, we will focus on convergence and we will try and keep the divergences out of our G20 presidency.
Let's now focus on the logistics. Now, how challenging is it to mount the biggest diplomatic event in India's history and to organize, as you said, a staggering 215 odd meetings? What are the various nuts and bolts that go into this mammoth production?
Well, as I said, this is the first time we have been president of the G20. There is no copybook that we can follow. We have to make sure that whatever we do and wherever we hold these meetings, those are of a standard that are very, very high. And we have been working very closely with all the stakeholders involved. The first, of course, are the states. States are very important in successful organization of G20 events across the country. The line ministry is concerned because many of these meetings are sectoral in nature. The line ministry takes the responsibility in many senses. And also, we've been working at the district level, at the level of the person on the ground. And I think that is very important. You go into granular detail. You make sure that you don't compromise on quality. And that has been I think, guiding factor in all of our organizational and logistical planning and preparations. We've also seen that the endeavor has been that we expose our guests and our G20 delegates not only to the country but also to the regional or the region where they go to. For example, if you are in Kashmir, you will be exposed to Kashmiri cuisine. You will be exposed to the major tourism sites of that place, the culture of that state. If you go to Kerala, you'll be exposed to Kerala cuisine, Kerala culture. So the states are the ones that would provide that. So the Prime Minister has actually, when in his conversation with the Chief Ministers, has encouraged that there should be a competition of the cultural troops, and the best troops should be presented at the G20. So we will be presenting really what would be the best of that culture to our G20 delegates. We will be providing them with cuisine that is regional and very authentic. We will also have millets as part of the cuisine, because millets has been not only traditional cuisine in India, but also this is the International Year of the Millets.
Exactly.
And of course, it is now considered to be a superfood, a health food. From our perspective, it has always been part of our diet. We will also, I think, take them through what we call Indian experiences. You've seen the Safa tying in Udaipur. You've seen the welcome with drums at the Gateway of India in Mumbai. You've seen, the caparisoned elephants in Bengaluru, and in Kolkata. You've seen tremendous displays of, art with Durga Puja, etc. as a backdrop. So in every place, you've got an authenticity that is being presented. But it's being very, very, I would say, carefully curated and choreographed before it's presented. And at the same time, we are taking them to iconic places in these cities so that they can see the best of, the locations that they visit. So it is, in many senses, challenging. But at the same time, I think everybody is part of that organizational exercise, whether it is the central government, whether it is the states, whether it is the non-governmental organizations that are part of the organizational process, the AMCs, etc. So it's not just a whole of government approach; it's a whole of country approach in the organization of the G20. I would say presenting the G20 also to local populations is an important part of the exercise.
What is the progress of the state-of-the-art convention center that's coming up in Pragati Maidan?
This, of course, is the venue of the summit, and I think from what I understand, the convention center is ready. We're waiting for the finishing touches, and no doubt that this will be, as you mentioned, a state-of-the-art venue. It would reflect not only the best of our architecture and design, but the best of our culture as well. When you go and see the interiors of this wonderful convention center.
Now, there are various engagement groups which will supplement the work of the presidency. Which are the various engagement groups that will be also happening together with the G20 in India?
So, the G20 operates at several levels. I mean, the main level is the government to government, but as you mentioned, there are also engagement groups that represent a non-governmental level. And that provides a base on which the G20 gets all its recommendations, its various ideas from. Now, these engagement groups are in cuts across different sectors. You have an engagement group on youth, you have on women, you have an urban, there is an urban 20, there is a business 20.
There's a think tank 20.
There is a think 20, civil 20. So it's really, and there's a science 20, there's a parliament 20. So it's a different sectors across. But what these engagement groups do is it allows a much broader participation in the G20. So many people feel the G20 is purely government to government. It is not. Through these engagement groups, we have an inclusive participation. So businesses across the country, the associations, business associations can take part. Of course, there are nodal points. The nodal points organize meetings. The nodal points also bring together the different strands of participation from the country. But essentially what we'd like to see is as inclusive an approach in the, let's say, participation of different groups within these segments. And I think, from what I can see, Women's 20, for example, is doing a great job in trying to mobilize, different, I would say, ideas and different proposals. Also getting women's groups involved in that exercise. So all of these I would say, all of these different engagement groups are gearing up to the meetings that are going to begin, from this month onwards.
My final question. There used to be a perception that the G20 is being controlled by the G7. So how do we institutionalize a strong development agenda for the G20 given that India's presidency is going to be followed by those of Brazil and South Africa?
So, of course, if you look at the genesis of the G20, initially it was the G7 that actually expanded to become the G20. In the financial crisis of 2008, I think there was a realization that in order to provide solutions that were global and representative in nature, you needed to involve the major emerging economies of the world. And that's how we brought the G20. And that same philosophy applies today. In order to find solutions to any of the global challenges, you need the global north and the global south to come together. India has been at the high table. We have, Prime Minister Modi has been invited to many of the G7 summits. We are part of the Quad, we are part of BRICS, we are part of the SCO. We straddle that space. But at the end of the day, as I said before, we are part of the developing world. So we need to articulate the concerns and ideas of that segment of the globe. We have, of course, a very fortunate conjuncture that we have Indonesia as the president. We take over. We are now the president of the G20. We will hand over the baton to Brazil, which will then be passing this on to South Africa. So we'll have 4 developing countries in a row that would have this. And in many senses, this is an opportunity to make the G20 a more broad-based organization, to bring in, as you mentioned, a developmental agenda, which I think has always been there in the G20. But it comes in with the character today that is more representative, that would take into account the larger interests of the globe. And I think this is what the G20 should be looking at. How can the G20 as a very representative grouping, as an influential grouping, as a grouping that accounts for 85% of the GDP of countries across the world, how can the G20 make that essential difference, not only to countries, but the lives of every single individual on this earth? And I think that is the responsibility and challenge that India, under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi, is ready to take on.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Shringla, for taking us so comprehensively through India's G20 roadmap. India's G20 presidency is an unprecedented opportunity to focus on the global south and, as Ambassador Shringla said, to shape a new paradigm of human-centric globalization. As we navigate through a turbulent time, India's G20 presidency offers hope to the world for a sustainable, equitable, and inclusive future. That is all I have for you in this edition of Diplomatic Dispatch. Thank you for watching. Until we meet again, take care and goodbye.